Chapter 1. Lemonade and laughter. The afternoon lay upon the Winthrop estate like a silken shawl, light and deliberate, warming the clipped lawns and stirring faint perfumes from the roses that bordered the gravel paths. White tables were arranged with symmetrical precision beneath striped awnings, their linen cloths crisp as folded letters. Porcelain cups chimed against saucers in a rhythm of civility. Laughter rose and settled again, like birds uncertain whether to take flight. It was an occasion of restrained gaiety. Invitations had been engraved, not printed. Gentle music from a string quartet drifted from the terrace steps, dignified and unhurried. The guests, ladies in pale summer dresses, gentlemen in tailored suits, moved in carefully considered arcs from table to table, as though mindful that elegance once disturbed was difficult to restore. At the center of it all stood a small circular arrangement of wicker chairs, placed deliberately beneath a white parasol. 5 chairs were occupied. The 6th stood empty before. That empty chair rested a glass of lemonade. The liquid had lost its sparkle. A single slice of lemon floated near the rim, dulling in the heat. A faint crescent of condensation marked the glass's earlier chill. Now it sweated no longer. No one, it seemed, could say precisely when the chair had become unoccupied. Mr. Percival Ashcroft, whose name had adorned the invitations and whose donations had helped underwrite the day's extravagance, was not a man easily overlooked. Tall, broad, shouldered, silver at the temples and immaculate in dress, he had the air of one accustomed to deference. He possessed, too, that subtle quality of presence which caused conversations to adjust around him. Yet now his chair stood vacant. Moments before, he had been the focus of attention. "Another tart, Mr. Ashcroft?" Sir Alister had asked cheerfully, gesturing toward a tray of raspberry confections. After the speech, perhaps, Ashcroft had replied with a half-smile, lifting his lemonade as though in anticipation. A guest, a stout gentleman in a lavender waistcoat, had turned and said, "He was just here, was he not?" The hostess, Lady Margaret Winthrop, whose garden party this technically was, blinked at the empty seat. "How odd. His chair is empty." There had been a pause, a ripple of polite confusion. It was then that Hercule Poirot, seated slightly apart beneath the parasol's shade, set down his teacup with deliberate care. "Observe, my friends," he said quietly. The cup cools, yet no cry was heard. A younger woman, pale and wide-eyed, laughed nervously. Surely he stepped away. Poirot's gaze passed over the semicircle of faces, lingering not on alarm but on expression, on the arrangement of brows, the tension in fingers clasped around porcelain, the subtle exchange of glances. "Or perhaps," he said softly, "you all permitted him to disappear." The words fell like a pebble in still water. The Winthrop estate lay some miles beyond the village of Lower Broadhurst, a property of old brick and ivy that had seen 3 generations of calculated prosperity. Percival Ashcroft had inherited both the house and the reputation of industry from his father, expanding the family's manufacturing interests into ventures that spanned continents. He was not beloved, but he was admired. And he was, above all, visible. For such a man to vanish, without raised voice, without commotion, suggested not chaos, but intention. The first response, of course, was dismissal. "He has likely gone inside," said Gerald Markham, Ashcroft's business associate, adjusting his cuffs. "The heat is oppressive." Without a word, Lady Margaret Winthrop murmured. "He is not a child," Markham replied briskly. "He requires no escort." Yet it was difficult to ignore the peculiarity. The path from the parasol to the terrace lay open, bordered by rose hedges, trimmed waste. High beyond that, the lawn extended, uninterrupted toward the house. There were no gates, no hidden alcoves, no shrubberies dense enough to conceal a man of Ashcroft's stature. Poirot rose. His movements were unhurried, his posture exact. He approached the empty chair and regarded it as one might a witness. The wicker bore the faint impression of recent weight. The cushion, a pale blue, remained slightly indented. He touched the lemonade glass with one careful finger. "Still cool," he murmured. but no longer cold. He turned to Lady Margaret Winthrop. "Madam, how long since the tray was last replenished?" "Perhaps 15 minutes," she said uncertainly. "I believe so." And Mr. Ashcroft had been seated continuously. "Yes, yes, I believe so." He was discussing the speech he intended to give, something about new investments. Markham cleared his throat. He was in excellent spirits. Poirot's eyes flicked to him. Indeed, certainly, he had every reason to be. "Reason," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. A murmur stirred among the guests. Some had risen. Others craned their necks toward the house. A servant was dispatched discreetly to inquire within minutes past. The string quartet faltered. The servant returned pale. "Sir is not in the drawing-room, nor the study, nor the hall." The murmur became a tremor. Poirot did not share in their agitation. He moved slowly along the perimeter of the lawn, examining the gravel path. His gaze dropped to the grass, then to the hedges. He crouched, careful of his immaculate trousers, and studied the earth near the parasol's base. No signs of struggle, no overturned chair, no shattered glass. The lemonade stood upright and untouched beyond a single sip. He returned to the circle of guests. "My friends," he said calmly, "let us be orderly. We must consider not what is dramatic, but what is logical." "You do not think," began the pale young woman, whose name Poirot recalled as Celia Hensley, a distant cousin. "I think nothing," Poirot replied gently. "I observe." He gestured toward the empty chair. "A man does not evaporate. Therefore, he has departed. If he has departed, he has done so by a path. That path is either visible or concealed." "Concealed," Lady Margaret Winthrop whispered. "Concealed," Poirot affirmed. "Not by magic, but by perception," Markham frowned. "Are you suggesting someone assisted him?" "I suggest," Poirot said evenly, "that we must not assume the obvious merely because it is comforting." The hostess pressed a hand to her throat. "This is absurd. We are in full daylight." "Precisely," said Poirot. "Daylight invites complacency." He turned slowly, surveying the assembly. There were perhaps 30 guests in total scattered now in uneasy clusters. Among them, Gerald Markham, the business associate, Celia Hensley, the cousin, Dr. Leonard Bryce, Ashcroft's personal physician, Marian Vale, a former secretary, and Sir Alistair Winthrop, the hostess's husband. Each face bore surprise. But surprise, Poirot knew, was a performance easily rehearsed. An hour later, the local authorities had been summoned. The grounds were searched with increasing urgency. Servants combed the gardens. The small ornamental lake was examined. The house was inspected room by room. No sign. The lemonade remained on the table, abandoned. Poirot stood once more beneath the parasol as the sun began its slow descent. He replayed the scene in his mind, the host's offer of tart, Ashcroft's reply, the faint lift of glass, the conversation's gentle hum, the turning of heads toward a joke at the far table. A moment, a gap. He approached Lady Margaret Winthrop again. "Madam, during the last 5 minutes before his absence was noted, was there any distraction?" She hesitated. "There was. A small commotion. A tray dropped, I believe." "Where?" "Near the Rose Arch." Poirot's eyes sharpened, and all of you turned. "It was loud." "How long?" "Only seconds." Poirot nodded slowly. "Seconds," he repeated. "Ah." Markham stepped forward, irritation edging his voice. "You cannot mean that in mere seconds." "In mere seconds," Poirot interrupted softly. "A decision may be executed, a path may be taken, a man may stand." He gestured toward the lawn. "Consider if Mr. Ashcroft rose during that distraction, if he moved not toward the house, but sideways, into the blind angle between hedge and parasol, he might pass unnoticed. But to where?" Celia Hensley asked. Poirot's gaze rested upon the rose hedges. "There is always," he said, "a direction which the eye does not favor." The police inspector approached, hat in hand. No sign of forced exit, no witnesses beyond the party. It is as though he vanished into air. Poirot inclined his head. Air, he murmured. Number, not air. He looked once more at the lemonade. You see, Inspector, the mystery is not that Mr. Ashcroft is gone. The mystery is that he chose this moment. Chose, the inspector echoed. Yes, a garden party. Witnesses aplenty, music, politeness, distraction. He turned back to the assembled guests, who now watched him with something approaching fear. Ask yourselves, Poirot said gently, who benefits from a disappearance that appears impossible? Silence. The breeze stirred the parasol's fringe. And, he added, his voice lowering, who smiled at him last? The wicker chair remained empty. The lemonade had grown warm, and somewhere beyond the ordered hedges and courteous laughter, a design had already begun to unfold. Chapter 2. The empty chair. The garden had not altered in its arrangement, yet its atmosphere had shifted by a degree so fine that only the observant could measure it. The guests still stood in clusters. The quartet still played with professional discretion. Porcelain still chimed faintly in the sunlight, and yet the harmony had acquired a question mark. Hercule Poirot stood beside the empty wicker chair, as though it were an object displayed for analysis rather than furniture designed for leisure. He did not touch it at once. He walked around it slowly, twice, his head inclined, his hands lightly clasped behind his back. To the casual eye, it was an ordinary chair, pale wicker, neatly cushioned, positioned with geometric symmetry around the circular table. But to Poirot, objects retained memory. They betrayed pressure, intention, habit. He bent slightly and studied the cushion. The indentation remained distinct, not deep. Mr. Ashcroft had not been a heavy man, but recent. The fabric had not yet resumed its original smoothness. Sunlight traced the hollow like a faint shadow. He was just here, murmured Mrs. Dalrymple again, as though repetition might reassemble reality. Poirot straightened and adjusted his cuffs with deliberate care. Yes, he said, just here. He leaned closer to the small table. The lemonade glass stood slightly to the right of center, not carelessly placed, but returned to a position of order. The lemon slice drifted lazily, its brightness already dimming. Then his gaze rested upon the napkin. It lay upon the saucer, folded into a compact rectangle, edges aligned with almost fastidious precision. He spoke without looking up. Notice the napkin, folded, not dropped. Sir Alister, who had rejoined the immediate circle, cleared his throat. He was a careful man. Poirot turned his head slightly, fixing the host with an unreadable expression. Careful men do not vanish mid-sentence. The words landed gently, but they did not dissipate. Colonel Bristow stepped forward, attempting practicality. Perhaps he felt unwell. Poirot inclined his head politely. Then where is the haste? No overturned chair, no scattered crumbs, no disturbed tablecloth. Illness is rarely courteous. Lady Margaret's fan fluttered once, then stilled. Are you suggesting this was arranged? Poirot regarded her carefully before answering. I suggest only that the exit was expected. The faintest tremor passed through the assembled guests. Expected. It was a word that implied foreknowledge. Sir Alister frowned. Expected by whom? That, said Poirot softly, is precisely the correct question. He lowered himself suddenly into the empty chair. The movement startled several of the guests. Poirot adjusted his position minutely until he occupied precisely the angle at which Ashcroft had been seated. He placed his hands upon his knees and looked outward across the garden. From here, he observed, Mr. Ashcroft faced the rose hedges and, beyond them, the gravel path. He was not positioned toward the terrace or the musicians. Lady Margaret followed his line of sight. The hedges are merely decorative. Nothing, said Poirot gently, is merely decorative. He leaned forward slightly. At what hour did the conversation become animated? Mrs. Dalrymple responded first. Shortly after 3:30, we were speaking of the election in Westborough. Yes, Colonel Bristow confirmed. Voices were raised. Raised, Poirot repeated. He closed his eyes briefly, reconstructing, voices overlapping, attention shifting, laughter rising, a collective turning inward toward discussion. He opened his eyes again. During this spirited exchange, who was facing Mr. Ashcroft directly? There was hesitation. Sir Alister gestured vaguely. We were in a circle. But not perfectly symmetrical, Poirot replied. After a moment, a young woman stepped forward. She had remained silent until now, slender, composed, with observant grey eyes. Miss Eleanor Grant, Lady Margaret's companion. I was seated opposite him, she said quietly. Poirot regarded her with interest. And did you observe him rise? Miss Grant hesitated, not evasively, but thoughtfully. I observed him glance toward the hedges, twice. The group shifted. And then, Poirot asked. I turned to answer Mrs. Dalrymple when I looked back. The chair was empty. Poirot nodded slowly. No scraping sound. Number, no apology. Number. He rose from the chair again. This, then, is not a departure interrupted by distraction. It is a departure concealed by distraction. Sir Alister bristled faintly. Concealed suggests intention. Indeed. Poirot moved now to the grass beside the chair. He crouched slightly, examining the ground. The lawn was well kept, trimmed evenly, resilient underfoot. It bore no obvious impression of hurried steps. He traced a small semicircle with his finger in the air. If Mr. Ashcroft rose, he would likely have pushed the chair back slightly. Yet observe, its legs are aligned precisely with the table's edge. There is no deviation. Mrs. Dalrymple gasped faintly. You mean he replaced it, or someone did? Silence deepened. Lady Margaret lowered her fan entirely. You imply that he did not simply stand and wander away. Poirot regarded her with steady courtesy. Madame, when a man leaves unexpectedly, the world registers it. A servant glances up. A guest shifts aside. A chair scrapes. But here, there is harmony, unbroken. The quartet's melody drifted faintly from the terrace, stubbornly cheerful. Sir Alister attempted levity once more. You find orchestration in coincidence. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Coincidence is a word invented to comfort those who do not wish to observe. He turned slowly, surveying the immediate guests. You were all engaged in conversation, animated, engrossed. Yes, admitted Colonel Bristow. Then for how long did no one look directly at Mr. Ashcroft? The question lingered uncomfortably. Miss Grant spoke again. Perhaps a minute, perhaps 2, 5, Poirot said softly. 5, Sir Alister repeated. The butler informed me he passed this table at 3:30. Mr. Ashcroft was present, stirring his drink. At 3:35, the chair was empty. Mrs. Dalrymple's hand rose to her throat. 5 minutes, she whispered. Yes, said Poirot. 5 minutes were sufficient. Sir Alister's expression hardened slightly. You suggest that in 5 minutes a man can orchestrate his own disappearance. Poirot met his gaze calmly. Not alone. The word settled like dust. Lady Margaret stepped closer to the table, examining the napkin as though seeing it for the first time. He always folded his napkin, she said, almost defensively. Always? Poirot asked gently. Yes, at dinner, at luncheon, and at garden parties, he pressed. She faltered. I do not know. Poirot smiled faintly, not unkindly. Habit is consistent, but context alters behavior. When one is engaged in animated debate, one does not typically pause to achieve geometric precision. He picked up the napkin delicately between finger and thumb. It was folded, not merely once, but twice, edges aligned. Placed, he said quietly, not abandoned. He returned it exactly as he had found it. Sir Alister folded his arms. If you believe this departure was assisted, then say so plainly. Poirot regarded the host thoughtfully. Very well. The arrangement of the chair, the folded napkin, the untouched crumbs, the cooling lemonade, the absence of sound, all suggest that Mr. Ashcroft did not flee, he exited. And with assistance. Lady Margaret asked. That remains to be determined. Miss Grant's eyes moved toward the hedges. He looked in that direction, she said softly. Poirot followed her gaze. Yes, toward the hedges. The roses stood immaculate, their crimson blooms heavy and fragrant. Behind them lay a narrow strip of shadow where sunlight struggled to penetrate. The garden hums on, Poirot murmured, almost to himself, unwilling to disturb its own harmony. He straightened once more. My friends, understand this. Absence does not create disorder here. It preserves it. Sir Alister frowned. Preserves? Yes, if Mr. Ashcroft had cried out, stumbled, or collapsed, your afternoon would be ruined. Instead, nothing. Mrs. Dalrymple's voice trembled slightly. You speak as though we benefited. Poirot's eyes softened, though his tone remained firm. I speak as one who observes that no one wished to interrupt the music. The implication hung delicately, but unmistakably. Lady Margaret drew herself up. You think we ignored him? Poirot inclined his head. I think you permitted him to go. Silence answered him. Beyond the hedges, a faint breeze stirred gravel. Poirot turned his head toward the sound. 5 minutes, he repeated quietly. Enough time for a conversation. Enough time for an agreement. Sir Alister exhaled slowly. What agreement? Poirot's gaze returned to the empty chair. That, he said, is what we must now discover. The indentation in the cushion had begun at last to fade. Chapter 3. Clockwork servants. If the guests embodied distraction, the servants embodied precision. They moved across the lawn with the quiet certainty of mechanism, trays balanced, steps measured, eyes lowered but never unseeing. Their paths curved elegantly around tables and hedges, never colliding, never hesitating. A replenished glass appeared before thirst could be announced. A plate vanished, the moment crumbs grew untidy. It was a choreography rehearsed over years. Hercule Poirot stood near the edge of the terrace and observed them with the attentive pleasure of a man watching a finely constructed clock. To most eyes, servants blurred into the background of such occasions, efficient, discreet, forgettable. But to Poirot, their regularity was precisely what made them indispensable witnesses. A system reveals disturbance. He watched the butler, Mr. Grayson, tall, composed, silver-haired, carrying a tray of lemonade, with unerring balance. The man's path traced a subtle arc across the lawn, touching each table in sequence before returning to the terrace for replenishment. It was not random, it was patterned. Sir Alister, Poirot said softly, your staff are admirable. Sir Alister, who stood beside him with forced composure, managed a nod. They are well trained. Yes, said Poirot, very well trained. He turned and approached Mr. Grayson just as the butler concluded a circuit of the nearer tables. Mr. Grayson, Poirot began politely. The butler inclined his head. Sir. You passed the central table, the one occupied by Mr. Ashcroft, at 3:30. Precisely, sir. The answer came without hesitation. Poirot studied him closely. Mr. Grayson possessed the serenity of a man accustomed to order. His posture was upright, his expression neutral, his memory evidently disciplined. And Mr. Ashcroft? Poirot asked. Before the butler could reply, a young maid standing nearby, pale, earnest, no more than 20, spoke quietly. He was seated, sir, stirring his drink. Poirot's gaze shifted to her. Your name? Clara, sir. You recall this clearly? Yes, sir. The lemon slice had drifted to the side of the glass. He was turning it back with the spoon. Turning it back, Poirot repeated softly. The image struck him with precision, a man idly correcting the position of fruit in a glass, as though symmetry mattered. And at 3:35, Poirot asked. Mr. Grayson answered. The chair was empty. Empty, Poirot echoed. The lawn seemed to quiet in response. You are certain of the time? Quite certain, sir. I observed the terrace clock when returning with each tray. Poirot nodded appreciatively. An admirable habit. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the lawn. You follow the same route at each gathering? Yes, sir. And today, no deviation. None. Poirot's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. In such perfect timing, deviation would have been obvious. Mr. Grayson inclined his head. Yes, sir, yet you observed nothing unusual. The butler's composure did not waver. No, sir. Poirot shifted his attention to Clara. And you, madame. He corrected himself smoothly. Miss Clara, did you see Mr. Ashcroft rise? The girl hesitated, not evasively, but with genuine uncertainty. No, sir. I was clearing the table behind him. You were close. Yes, sir, within a few steps. And you heard no chair scrape? No, sir. No exclamation? No, sir. Poirot allowed a faint smile. Then 5 minutes were enough for invisibility. The phrase lingered between them. Sir Alister, who had approached during the exchange, frowned. Invisibility is a dramatic word. Is it? Poirot replied gently. A man sits. 5 minutes pass. The chair is empty. No one sees him depart. If that is not invisibility, what shall we call it? Sir Alister offered no answer. Poirot resumed his observation of the staff. A footman approached with a tray of pastries, navigating between tables with exact spacing. Another maid replaced a teapot with mechanical grace. Their rhythm had never faltered. That, Poirot reflected, was the essential detail. Mr. Grayson, he said. When Mr. Ashcroft was seated at 3:30, what was the condition of the surrounding guests? They were engaged in lively discussion, sir. Voices raised. Yes, sir. Attention inward. I believe so. And you, sir? Poirot asked, fixing him gently. Where was your attention? On my duties, which required you to observe the guests. Yes, sir. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. Yet you observed no interruption, no movement out of pattern. No, sir. Poirot's gaze drifted toward the hedges once more. If a man had been seized, dragged, or coerced, even subtly, the servant's choreography would have trembled. A sudden movement, a body passing unexpectedly, a collision of trajectories. Any such event would have registered. But nothing had registered. Tell me, Poirot continued, does anyone among the staff pass behind the rose hedges during service? Mr. Grayson shook his head. No, sir. Our path runs along the terrace side. The hedges conceal the old gravel walk. It is seldom used. Seldom, Poirot repeated. But not forbidden. No, sir. Poirot turned slowly toward the hedges, their leaves stirring faintly. A concealed path. A conversation at its loudest. Servants moving in predictable arcs. A man stirring his lemonade. Then absence. He returned his gaze to Clara. You were within a few steps of Mr. Ashcroft? Yes, sir. And yet you did not see him rise? No, sir. Poirot nodded. Then either he rose in a moment when your attention shifted precisely away from him, or he rose in concert with another. Sir Alister stiffened slightly. Concert? Yes, Poirot said calmly. Two movements aligned are more easily overlooked than one. Mr. Grayson's expression flickered, not alarm, but contemplation. You imply assistance, he said carefully. I imply timing. Poirot walked a few paces along the terrace, retracing the servants' route. He imagined the lawn divided into invisible lanes, the butler's arc, the maid's approach, the footman's retreat. Within such geometry, deviation would stand out like a broken tooth in a fine comb, and yet the pattern had remained intact, which meant the disappearance had occurred within the pattern, not against it. He stopped and faced them again. When Mr. Ashcroft was last seen stirring his drink, he said softly, was he alone? Mr. Grayson considered. He was part of the central group, sir. But physically, Poirot pressed, was anyone standing directly beside him? Clara's brow furrowed. I believe Mr. Charles Hale approached the table shortly before 3:30. Sir Alister turned sharply. Hale, my secretary, sir, Mr. Grayson supplied neutrally. Yes, yes, I know who he is, Sir Alister muttered. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Approached in what manner? He leaned slightly toward Mr. Ashcroft. Clara said, "As though to speak privately." "Privately," Poirot echoed. Sir Alister waved a dismissive hand. "Hale manages correspondence. It was likely trivial." "Trivial matters," Poirot observed gently, "rarely require leaning." Sir Alister did not respond. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back once more. "Mr. Grayson," he said, "when you returned at 3:35 and saw the chair empty, did you inquire immediately?" "No, sir. Guests come and go during such occasions." "And you assumed Mr. Ashcroft had joined another group?" "Yes, sir. A reasonable assumption," Poirot conceded. He looked across the lawn again. The servants continued their motions, unbroken, efficient, exact clockwork. "Yes," Poirot murmured. The rhythm never faltered. Sir Alister exhaled impatiently. "And what does that prove?" Poirot turned toward him. "It proves that whatever occurred did not disturb the machinery." "Machinery." "Your garden party," Poirot replied softly, "is a system. Servants, guests, music, conversation. Each element moves according to expectation. If Mr. Ashcroft had resisted, stumbled, or been surprised, the system would have reacted. And it did not," Sir Alister said. Number Poirot's gaze grew intent. "Therefore, Mr. Ashcroft's departure was synchronized." "With what?" Lady Margaret asked quietly from behind them. "With the moment when no one was looking." The breeze lifted the edge of a tablecloth. Poirot's voice dropped. 5 minutes, he said. 5 minutes in which conversation swelled, servants turned, and attention dissolved. He glanced once more toward the hedges, toward the hidden gravel walk. "In such conditions," he concluded softly, "a man need not be invisible." He paused. "He need only be expected elsewhere." Chapter 4. The curtain of conversation as the afternoon advanced. The sunlight softened but did not fade. It lingered across the lawn in golden sheets, touching shoulders and hat brims, catching in the glassware like restrained fire. From a distance, the gathering appeared untroubled, an assembly of cultivated minds engaged in animated discourse. Only at its center did the invisible gap persist, like a missing note in an otherwise perfect chord. Hercule Poirot stood once more among the guests, not at the terrace now, but within the very circle that had surrounded Percival Ashcroft in his final visible moments. He did not speak immediately. He allowed them to resume their positions, to inhabit once more the arrangement they had held at 3:30. "You were discussing politics," he said at last. "Let us reconstruct." Colonel Bristow cleared his throat, instinctively assuming authority. "We were discussing the election." "Ah, yes," said Poirot mildly. "The election, always a subject that elevates the volume." Mrs. Dalrymple nodded vigorously. It was quite animated. Another guest, Mr. Lionel Reeves, a poet of modest reputation and extravagant opinions, added, "Yes, quite heatedly." Poirot's gaze moved from face to face. They stood now as they had stood then, though less certain of their footing. "And Mr. Ashcroft?" Poirot asked. "He contributed." "Oh, certainly," said Colonel Bristow. "He had views on fiscal reform." "Practical views," Mrs. Dalrymple added. Mr. Reeves gave a small shrug. He preferred moderation. "Moderation," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. He folded his hands behind his back. And then the guests exchanged glances. Mrs. Dalrymple frowned slightly. "Then we spoke of poetry." Mr. Reeves brightened. "Yes, I quoted a recent sonnet regarding civic decay." Colonel Bristow sniffed. "A gloomy piece. And Mr. Ashcroft?" Poirot pressed gently. There was hesitation. "He was listening," said Mrs. Dalrymple. He smiled. Miss Grant offered from the edge of the circle. Poirot inclined his head. He excused himself silence. Finally, Mrs. Dalrymple said uncertainly, "I do not remember." Poirot's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. How convenient, this collective amnesia. The words were quiet, yet they traveled through the circle like a current. Lady Margaret stepped forward, her composure thinning. "You think we ignored him?" Poirot regarded her without accusation, yet without retreat. "I think you chose the conversation over the man." The air seemed to contract. Colonel Bristow bristled. That is unfair. We were engaged in discussion. One cannot monitor every movement. Indeed, said Poirot. One cannot, and yet one might recall if a man stood beside one and departed. Mr. Reeves shifted uneasily. There was much laughter. Laughter, Poirot echoed. He turned slowly, studying each guest's position relative to the empty chair. You see, he said softly, conversation is like a curtain. When voices overlap, they obscure. When laughter rises, it covers smaller sounds. A garden party is a performance. Each of you has a cue. You respond, you react, you deliver your line. Mrs. Dalrymple's lips parted slightly. You make it sound deliberate. Not deliberate, Poirot corrected gently. Habitual. He pointed lightly toward the space where Ashcroft had sat. Mr. Ashcroft was central, yet not dominant. He was a listener, a contributor, yes, but not one who demanded the floor. Such men are easily overlooked when discourse becomes competitive. Colonel Bristow flushed faintly. You imply selfishness. I imply human nature. Poirot stepped closer to Mrs. Dalrymple. When you spoke of the election, did you look directly at Mr. Ashcroft? Yes, she said quickly. And when Mr. Reeves quoted his sonnet, she hesitated. I believe I turned toward him. And during that turn, did you observe Mr. Ashcroft's hands? Number his posture. Number his movement. She swallowed. Number, Poirot nodded, not triumphantly, but with quiet satisfaction. Mr. Reeves spoke defensively. Surely he might have excused himself softly. Softly, Poirot repeated. Without brushing your sleeve, without shifting the chair, without any interruption. It is possible, Mr. Reeves insisted. Possible, Poirot agreed. But is it probable? The group fell silent. Miss Grant, who had remained observant throughout, spoke quietly. I recall a moment just before I turned to Mrs. Dalrymple. Mr. Ashcroft seemed to lean slightly backward. Backward? Poirot asked. Yes, as though someone had spoken behind him. All eyes turned instinctively toward the hedges. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Behind him, Miss Grant nodded. I thought nothing of it. Of course, Poirot said gently. Because you were engaged. Sir Alister interjected with visible impatience. If someone addressed him from behind, why did none of us hear it? Poirot answered calmly. Because your attention was elsewhere. Colonel Bristow shook his head. One would notice another person entering the circle. Would one? Poirot countered. He gestured toward the lawn. Servants move constantly. Guests approach and withdraw. A secretary leans in with a document. In a moment of heightened debate, the eye narrows. It selects what confirms engagement and ignores what does not. Lady Margaret's fan trembled faintly in her hand. You believe someone approached him from behind the hedge? I believe, said Poirot slowly, that someone positioned themselves where Mr. Ashcroft alone could see them clearly. Mrs. Dalrymple inhaled sharply and signaled. Perhaps. Mr. Reeves frowned. Signaled what? An agreement, Poirot replied softly. Sir Alister's voice hardened. This is conjecture. Yes, Poirot agreed readily. But it is conjecture supported by pattern. He paced a small arc within the circle. At 3:30, Mr. Ashcroft is seated, stirring his drink. Conversation rises. Attention shifts inward. At some moment within 5 minutes, he glances toward the hedges. He leans slightly backward, as Miss Grant observed. He stands, yet no one notes it. He replaces his chair precisely. He folds his napkin with care. He departs, without farewell. Mrs. Dalrymple whispered, and none of us looked. None, Poirot confirmed. The quartet, perhaps sensing tension, modulated into a softer passage. Poirot's voice dropped in tandem. Silence, he said. Was the accomplice? Colonel Bristow stared at him. Silence. Yes, the silence between your words, the silence in which no one asked, where is Mr. Ashcroft? The silence in which assumption replaced observation. Lady Margaret's composure faltered visibly. You make us sound culpable. Poirot's expression softened. I do not accuse you of crime. I observe that absence requires cooperation. Sir Alister folded his arms tightly. And what, precisely, are you suggesting we cooperated in? Poirot met his gaze directly. In permitting a man to disappear. The words settled heavily. Mrs. Dalrymple's voice trembled. We did not permit anything. We were unaware. Exactly, Poirot said. He turned slowly toward the empty chair once more. You were unaware because you chose engagement over awareness, conversation over vigilance, performance over perception. Mr. Reeves shifted uncomfortably. A garden party is not a battlefield. No, Poirot agreed. It is a stage. He allowed that to resonate. On a stage, one trusts that the actors will remain within the scene. When one exits unexpectedly, the audience assumes it is part of the script. Lady Margaret stared at him. Are you saying Mr. Ashcroft's departure was scripted? Poirot considered before answering. I am saying that the conditions were ideal for it to appear so. The breeze stirred the roses again. A petal loosened and drifted downward, landing unnoticed upon the grass. Poirot's gaze followed it briefly. You see, he concluded quietly, if Mr. Ashcroft had stumbled or protested, you would have turned. But he did neither. He exited with composure. You assumed continuity. Sir Alister exhaled sharply. And now? Poirot's eyes reflected the fading light. Now, he said, we must determine whether that composure was voluntary or compelled. The circle remained still. Behind them. Beyond the hedge, the gravel path lay unseen, and in the space once occupied by lively debate, there lingered something far more troubling than disagreement. A pause that had not been acknowledged, a departure that had not been witnessed, and a silence that had been shared by all. Chapter 5, The Hidden Path, the rose hedges, so admired for their symmetry and fragrance, had until now served as ornament and boundary, a decorative frame enclosing cultivated civility. From the lawn they appeared thick and impenetrable, their blossoms arranged in disciplined abundance, yet a narrow gap scarcely noticeable, unless one sought it, opened between two dense clusters of leaves. Hercule Poirot paused before this gap, as though acknowledging the threshold of another scene. Permit me, he said quietly. Without waiting for objection, he parted the foliage with careful hands and stepped beyond the perfumed barrier. The change was immediate. The laughter and music of the lawn softened, as though absorbed by the hedge. The air cooled slightly in shadow. Beneath his shoes, the texture shifted from resilient grass to gravel. Fine, pale stones laid in a narrow ribbon that curved discreetly along the back of the garden. Sir Alister followed. Somewhat reluctantly, Lady Margaret came after him, lifting her skirts just enough to preserve dignity. Miss Grant and Colonel Bristow completed the small procession. The path was no more than 3 feet wide, bordered by ivy and the rear wall of the hedge. It did not advertise itself. Indeed, from the main lawn it was entirely concealed. Poirot walked a few paces, then stopped. He bent slowly, lowering himself with surprising grace for a man of his compact build. His eyes examined the gravel with meticulous intensity. The stones were small, pale, and irregular. Most lay evenly pressed, their arrangement undisturbed by recent passage. But in one section, a subtle arc near the hedge opening, the pattern faltered. He pointed delicately. See here, the gravel is shifted. Sir Alister leaned forward, frowning. Servants passed that way. Poirot did not look up. Not today. Their route is the opposite side. Sir Alister opened his mouth, then closed it again. The disturbance was not dramatic. No deep heel mark, no gouged trench, rather a brushing, as though cautious souls had compressed the stones with controlled pressure. Someone walked here recently, Colonel Bristow observed. Yes, said Poirot softly. Within the hour, he traced 2 faint impressions with a gloved finger. Observe the alignment. One print partially overlaps another. Lady Margaret drew in a breath. Then Ashcroft walked alone. Poirot rose slowly, dusting his gloves with exactitude. "Number the word," carried quiet certainty. "These prints overlap." Sir Alister stiffened. "You are certain?" "I am certain that two persons walked this path in close proximity." Miss Grant knelt carefully, examining the faint markings. "I see what you mean," she murmured. "One edge is sharper, the other slightly blurred." "Precisely," said Poirot, pleased. "The first step compresses the gravel. The second, falling partly within it, disturbs the margin." Colonel Bristow folded his arms. "Then two men walked together." "Or a man and another," Poirot replied. Lady Margaret's voice was barely audible. "Two sets." Poirot straightened fully now, his gaze traveling along the curve of the path. "Yes, two actors leaving the stage together." The phrase lingered in the shaded air. The path curved gently away from the lawn, following the rear perimeter of the garden. It did not lead toward the front gates or the carriage drive. Instead, it turned inward, deeper into the property. Poirot began to walk. His pace was measured, neither hurried nor languid. The others followed, subdued now, their earlier defensiveness replaced by uneasy anticipation. As they progressed, the sounds of the garden party diminished further. The quartet became a faint thread of melody, laughter, a distant echo. The gravel bore additional signs, slight compressions at intervals, always paired, always close together. Poirot halted again. "You see," he said softly, "there is no sign of struggle. The stride is even, no dragging, no erratic pressure." Sir Alister swallowed. "You believe Ashcroft walked willingly. I believe he was not forced." Colonel Bristow frowned. "Then why conceal it?" Poirot's eyes flickered toward him. To avoid interruption, the path widened slightly. As it approached a small clearing, partially concealed by climbing ivy and aged trees, there, nestled in a pocket of shadow, stood the old summer-house. It was octagonal, wooden painted, once in white, now softened by time into muted cream. Ivy traced its edges like careful penmanship. Its windows, though clean, reflected little but greenery. Lady Margaret exhaled softly. "The summer-house is seldom used." "Yet it is maintained," Poirot observed. "Yes, it is part of the garden. Part of the design," he thought. He advanced toward the entrance. The gravel here showed deeper compression, two sets of prints converging before the threshold. Poirot paused once more. "Observe," he said quietly, "the stones directly before the door bore overlapping impressions more distinct than those along the narrower path. One print angled slightly inward, as though the walker had turned toward the other." Sir Alister's jaw tightened. "They stopped here." "Yes," Miss Grant's voice trembled faintly. "To speak, perhaps," Poirot replied. He examined the door. It was closed but not latched. He placed his hand upon the handle and paused, glancing at Lady Margaret. "With your permission." She nodded. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the air was cooler, touched with the faint scent of aged wood and sun-warmed ivy. Dust lay in gentle patterns along the floorboards, undisturbed except in a narrow track from the entrance toward a small table near the window. A single wicker chair stood angled toward the light. Poirot stepped inside, slowly, absorbing details. The dust told its own quiet story. Two sets of footprints had entered. One had paused near the table. The other had moved toward the window. No signs of violence, no overturned furniture, no haste. Lady Margaret stood at the doorway, her composure thinning. "They came here," she whispered. "Yes," said Poirot. Colonel Bristow surveyed the modest interior. And then Poirot's eyes rested on the small table. "There," he said softly. Upon the table lay a single envelope. It bore no address. No seal had been broken. No writing marked its surface. Poirot approached it with measured steps. He did not touch it immediately. Instead, he examined the surrounding dust. Lone set of prints circled the table. The other remained nearer the entrance. "They entered together," he murmured. "One approached this table. The other waited." Sir Alister's voice was tight. "Waiting for what?" Poirot picked up the envelope delicately. For confirmation. Lady Margaret stepped forward despite herself. Confirmation of what? Poirot turned the envelope over. It was sealed. He opened it carefully and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it blank, completely blank. Colonel Bristow blinked. Blank. Yes, Miss Grant frowned. That makes no sense. On the contrary. Poirot said quietly, refolding the paper with precise movements. It makes a great deal of sense. Sir Alister stared at him. Explain. Poirot returned the blank sheet to the envelope and placed it back upon the table exactly as he had found it. A blank page, he said softly, is not absence. It is potential. Lady Margaret's eyes widened slightly. You believe it is a signal? Yes. To whom? Poirot's gaze shifted toward the window. Perhaps to those who agreed to understand. Sir Alister's patience frayed. This is absurd. An unsigned envelope, a blank page. These prove nothing. They prove intention, Poirot corrected calmly. He stepped back toward the entrance, glancing once more at the paired footprints in the dust. You see, he continued, a disappearance need not be an exit from the property. Colonel Bristow frowned. What do you mean? Poirot gestured toward the path they had followed. The gravel leads not outward, but inward. He paused deliberately. A disappearance may be an entrance elsewhere. The words settled in the dim summer house. Outside, beyond the ivy, the garden party continued its performance. But here, in this quiet structure hidden behind roses, the second act had clearly begun. Chapter 6. The summer house stood apart from the cultivated civility of the lawn, like a withheld thought. Ivy climbed its pale wooden panels in careful spirals, softening its edges, drawing it deeper into shadow. From the outside it appeared decorative, a romantic remnant of an earlier age. Yet its position within the grounds was not accidental. It lay neither at the boundary nor in the open center. It was placed precisely where it might be reached without attracting notice. Hercule Poirot remained just within its threshold, allowing his eyes to adjust fully to the filtered light. The interior was modest, octagonal walls, narrow windows, a small table placed near one of them, and a single wicker chair angled toward the garden. Dust rested in pale constellations across the floorboards, undisturbed except where two sets of footprints traced a clear narrative from entrance to table. The air held a peculiar stillness. It feels, murmured Miss Grant quietly behind him, as though something has just concluded. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Or is about to begin. He approached the small table once more. Upon it rested the envelope, plain, cream, colored, unaddressed. It bore no seal impressed with wax, no marking to indicate sender or recipient. Its simplicity was deliberate. An envelope, he said softly, but unsigned. Sir Alister stepped forward, his impatience thinly veiled by curiosity. Is it his? Poirot did not answer at once. He lifted the envelope carefully, turning it over between his fingers. There is no handwriting, he observed, no identifying mark. He opened it again and withdrew the single sheet within. It contains no words, only blank paper. Colonel Bristow's brows rose sharply. Blank. Yes, the words seemed to hang in the quiet room as conspicuous as ink would have been. Mr. Lionel Reeves, who had followed reluctantly, leaned closer. Surely that is meaningless. Poirot's gaze sharpened faintly. On the contrary, a blank page can speak eloquently. Lady Margaret clasped her hands together. Speak what? Intention, Poirot replied. He moved toward the window. From that vantage point, one could glimpse the edge of the lawn beyond the hedge, the pale suggestion of movement, a fragment of white linen, the faint shimmer of glass in sunlight. The garden party continued, unaware that its harmony had been dissected. Poirot gestured toward the angled chair. Observe its position. The chair faced the window directly, not the door. Whoever sat here wished to see the lawn without being seen clearly in return. Sir Alister frowned. Seen by whom? By those from whom one takes leave, Poirot answered. He crouched slightly, examining the dust beneath the chair. The imprint of recent occupation was visible, not heavy but distinct. One set of footprints had approached the table, paused, and then retreated toward the door. The other had advanced to the chair, turned it slightly, and sat. They did not remain long, Poirot murmured. How can you tell? Miss Grant asked. The dust beneath the chair is disturbed only once. No shifting, no repeated adjustments, a brief pause. Sir Alister's tone sharpened. You imply a meeting? Yes. And an agreement, Lady Margaret whispered. Poirot rose slowly. I imply rehearsal. The word unsettled them more than accusation might have done. Rehearsal, Colonel Bristow repeated. Yes, Poirot said. Consider, Mr. Ashcroft leaves the central lawn without remark. He walks beside another, along a concealed path. They enter a secluded structure. An envelope awaits. It contains a blank page. He held the sheet lightly between finger and thumb. This is not improvisation. It is preparation. Mr. Reeves shook his head. Preparation for what? There is no note, no instruction. There need not be, Poirot replied calmly. He returned the blank sheet to the envelope and placed it precisely upon the table once more. A signal, perhaps. Lady Margaret's eyes widened. For whom? For those who agreed to understand. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Sir Alister stepped closer, lowering his voice. You believe this was arranged in advance? Yes. And that Ashcroft knew? Yes. Colonel Bristow stiffened. You suggest he conspired in his own disappearance. Miss Grant's voice trembled faintly. But to what end? Poirot moved once more toward the window, studying the faint outlines of the garden beyond. Tell me, he said softly, how many among your guests are aware of Mr. Ashcroft's financial affairs? Sir Alister's expression hardened slightly. I do not discuss my guests' finances. Nevertheless, you are aware that he had recently encountered difficulty. Lady Margaret's eyes flickered. Rumors, she said quietly. Rumors, Poirot echoed. He turned back toward them. A man facing public embarrassment might prefer a controlled exit, one that appears accidental, one that requires no explanation. Mr. Reeves frowned. But why the blank paper? Poirot allowed himself the faintest smile. Because words can be intercepted. Sir Alister stiffened again. Intercepted, yes. A written message can be discovered, examined, misinterpreted. A blank page requires prior understanding. It conveys agreement without evidence. Miss Grant's gaze drifted to the envelope. So, it was proof. Not proof, Poirot corrected. Confirmation. Colonel Bristow folded his arms. And what was confirmed? Poirot walked toward the door, then paused and turned. That the moment had arrived. Outside, a faint ripple of laughter drifted through the hedge. Lady Margaret shivered despite the warmth. You speak as though he left willingly. Poirot's expression grew grave. I believe he left according to plan. Sir Alister's voice sharpened. Then why conceal it? Why not depart openly? Poirot met his gaze. Because open departure invites inquiry. He gestured subtly toward the lawn. Inquiry interrupts performance. Miss Grant looked again at the angled chair. And the rehearsal. Poirot nodded. Yes, a rehearsal of absence. He stepped outside the summer house once more, glancing back briefly at the interior. The air here feels paused, he said softly, as though waiting for applause. Sir Alister followed him into the dappled shade. Applause for what? For the successful execution of a scene, Poirot replied. Colonel Bristow exhaled sharply. You make it sound theatrical. Poirot's eyes held quiet certainty. My dear Colonel, everything about this afternoon is theatrical. The debate, the laughter, the precise service, the immaculate arrangement of chairs, and now the disappearance. Lady Margaret's voice was almost a whisper. What role did we play? Poirot regarded her carefully. You provided the audience. A breeze stirred the ivy along the summer-house wall. Poirot glanced down once more at the overlapping footprints in the gravel. They entered together, he murmured. They departed together. Sir Alister's composure cracked slightly. And then, Poirot's gaze travelled toward the deeper grounds beyond the summer-house, toward the lesser, used paths that led eventually to the small rear gate, near the lane. And then, he said quietly, the true departure occurred. He turned back toward the hedge opening. But before we pursue that, we must answer one question. Sir Alister stiffened. What question? Poirot's eyes gleamed with measured intensity. Who among you knew that a blank page would mean everything? The summer-house remained silent behind them, its single chair angled toward the window, its envelope resting upon the table like a prop awaiting its final cue. And somewhere beyond the garden walls, a man who had been present moments before now existed only as absence. Chapter 7, Permission. The light had changed almost imperceptibly, as though the day, having lent its brilliance to linen and glass, now withdrew it by degrees out of propriety. The sun sat lower, no longer the confident ruler of the lawn, but a softened presence that gilded rather than dazzled. White tablecloths took on a faint blush. The rose hedges darkened into richer color. The trimmed grass, once a polished green, became a tapestry of long shadows. Those shadows mattered to Hercule Poirot. They stretched from chair legs and parasol stands, from the hems of dresses and the polished tips of shoes. They lengthened in calm, inevitable lines, slender, accusing fingers laid across the lawn. In daylight, the garden party had been a picture of harmony. In this late afternoon glow, it began to resemble something else. A scene set for testimony. Poirot did not like scenes that pretended to be innocent. He moved with quiet intention toward the terrace where the quartet played. The musicians, whose faces had remained politely neutral throughout the disturbance, were now engaged in selecting a gentle piece, something that would keep the air agreeable without inviting attention. Poirot raised one hand, not sharply, but in that precise manner of his which suggested both courtesy and certainty. "If you please," he said. The first violinist hesitated, only a fraction, and then bowed his head. The music ended on a sustained note, which floated into the open air and dissolved like perfume. An odd quiet followed, not the quiet of peace, but of people suddenly aware that their own voices might be overheard. Poirot turned back toward the lawn. "My friends," he said, "may I ask you to gather here, near the central table, only for a few minutes? We shall be sensible. We shall not be theatrical, but we shall be exact." The word exact seemed to settle on them like a small, cold coin. Sir Alister Winthrop moved first, because hosts are trained to move first, and because he had learned, uncomfortably, that refusing Poirot only gave the detective more reason to insist. Lady Margaret followed, fan held tighter than before. Mrs. Dalrymple came with quick steps, and a face that had lost its earlier sparkle. Colonel Bristow approached with the stiff caution of a man who expects insult. Mr. Lionel Reeves, poet and provocateur, drifted in as though he might turn the whole affair into a metaphor if given the chance. Miss Eleanor Grant came quietly, her eyes watchful, the kind of watchfulness that does not announce itself. And Mr. Charles Hale, Sir Alister's secretary, took his place slightly behind the host, as though shadowing him were part of his professional duty. The empty wicker chair waited at the center of their circle. It looked innocent. The cushion had almost recovered its shape now. Only the faintest depression remained to hint at recent occupation. The lemonade glass still sat on the table, less cool, less inviting, as though time itself had sipped from it. The folded napkin lay where it had lain all along, so neat it seemed to mock them. Poirot stood opposite the chair, in full view of them all. The lowering sun lit one side of his face and left the other in gentle shade. The contrast pleased him, not as vanity, but as symbolism. Truth is always half, lit until one insists upon illumination. He did not begin with accusation. He began with something smaller, something that would draw them in before they realized they had yielded. "Each of you saw something small," Poirot said softly. He let the sentence sit there. It did not sound threatening. It sounded almost kind. Yet it made several people shift their weight, because it suggested that their innocence might not be as complete as they wished. Mrs. Dalrymple gave a little laugh that died quickly. I assure you, Monsieur Poirot, she caught herself remembering his earlier insistence on plain English. Mr. Poirot, I saw nothing. Poirot inclined his head politely. Ah, you saw nothing. That is a statement. Let us examine if it is true. He moved his gaze from one face to the next. Mrs. Dalrymple, when you spoke of the election, when your voice became animated, did you look toward Mr. Ashcroft? Yes, she said, relief brightening her tone. Of course, he was right there. And did you see him stand? Her relief faltered. Her eyes darted briefly, as if searching for the moment in her mind. I from somewhere in the circle. Another voice spoke, hesitant but clear. Whose nigh thought I saw him shift, as if to stand. Me had adorned the invitations and whose donations had helped underwrite the day's extravagance. It was Mrs. Dalrymple, after all. But now the words emerged as confession rather than certainty. Poirot's eyebrows lifted a fraction. You saw him stand? Yes, I thought he was stretching, or perhaps adjusting his coat. It was such a small movement. Small, Poirot repeated gently. Yes, small movements are the ones that become invisible when one is entertained. Colonel Bristow cleared his throat, as though to remind the group that he possessed discipline. It proves nothing. A man stands at a party. It is hardly a declaration of escape. Poirot nodded, as though conceding the point. Indeed, it is hardly a declaration, but it is one thread, and we are weaving. He turned slightly toward Mr. Reeves. You, Mr. Reeves, were speaking of poetry. Yes, civic decay. Mr. Reeves perked up despite the tension. Poets rarely resist being acknowledged. Yes, quite a fitting piece, I think. A nation is... Poirot raised one hand again, gently halting him. We will spare ourselves the entire poem. Tell me instead, did you observe Mr. Ashcroft while you spoke? Mr. Reeves hesitated. Vanity wrestled with honesty. Well, one does not typically monitor each listener. But you noticed something, Poirot said. Mr. Reeves frowned. I noticed he glanced toward the hedges. Poirot's head inclined in approval. Excellent, a glance. Sir Alister's expression tightened, as though he resented how easily details were being produced now that they were demanded. It could have been a casual glance. My guests are not prisoners. No, Poirot agreed. They are not prisoners. And yet, when a man is about to vanish, his glances are seldom casual. Lady Margaret's fan moved once, then stopped again, as if she had forgotten how to perform calm. Poirot looked toward Miss Grant. And you, Miss Grant, your eyes have been honest all afternoon. What did you see? Miss Grant spoke quietly, without drama. I thought he looked anxious. Lady Margaret turned sharply. Anxious Percival Ashcroft was never anxious. Miss Grant did not flinch. Only for a moment. Not enough to disturb the room, but enough to disturb me. He smiled. Yet his eyes did not match his smile. It was as though he were waiting for something to occur. Poirot's gaze warmed fractionally. Thank you, Madame. Again he corrected himself with care. Thank you. He turned back to the circle. So one saw him stand. One saw him glance toward concealment. One saw anxiety. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, more intimate, as if he were sharing a truth with friends rather than interrogating suspects. Yet none asked why. The sentence did not accuse them of cruelty. It accused them of preference. Sir Alister's jaw tightened. It seemed impolite. Poirot looked at him with something like gentle pity. Ah, politeness, the most elegant accomplice. Mrs. Dalrymple made a small sound, half protest, half shame. You make it sound as though we planned it. No, Poirot said. I make it sound as though you permitted it. Colonel Bristow's cheeks reddened. Permitted. We did not escort him to the hedge. Poirot nodded, accepting the outrage as part of the process. But you did something more subtle. and more useful. You gave him cover. He began to walk slowly around the empty chair, as though it were the center of a diagram and they were points upon its perimeter. His steps were measured, his gaze remained steady. Tell me, Colonel Bristow, when you speak, do you prefer interruption? Certainly not, and if someone rises quietly at your elbow while you deliver your argument, do you pause your speech to inquire? The colonel hesitated, annoyed at being cornered by manners. One does not wish to appear distrustful. Or foolish, Poirot added quietly. A faint ripple went through the guests. That word, foolish, touched vanity more sharply than any suggestion of guilt. Poirot stopped near Lady Margaret. Lady Margaret, you are a gracious hostess. Your eye travels constantly. You notice empty cups, wilted flowers, awkward silences. Lady Margaret lifted her chin. I do. And yet you did not notice a man leaving your central group. The fan in her hand trembled. I assumed he stepped away for air, she said defensively. Men do that. Poirot nodded gently. Yes, men do that. And women do not chase them, because to chase is to suggest one suspects something it would be improper. Lady Margaret's mouth tightened. Poirot turned toward Mrs. Dalrymple again. And you, madame, you saw him stand. You felt perhaps the faint unease of it, yet you returned to the election. Mrs. Dalrymple's voice was small. The discussion was heated. Yes, said Poirot. Heated discussions are wonderfully useful. They create noise, and noise creates a curtain. Mr. Reeves stirred uneasily. A curtain? Poirot's eyes gleamed faintly. Yes, conversation is a curtain. Voices overlap like layers of fabric. One cannot see through it unless one chooses to pull it aside. He let them absorb that. The garden behind them hummed softly with distant, half-restrained chatter. Other guests who had not been summoned to this circle, still trying to preserve the party's illusion of normality. Poirot's voice lowered. A garden party is a performance, he said. It is designed to reassure everyone that life is tidy, that nothing awkward will happen. That if something awkward does happen, it will be ignored until it becomes polite again. Sir Alister snapped. We are not actors. Poirot's gaze did not waver. Are you certain? You have your lines, Sir Alister. Hospitality, reassurance, light humor. Lady Margaret has hers. Grace, composure, the perfection of the tablecloth. Colonel Bristow has his. Authority, principle. Mr. Reeves has his. Witty cynicism. Mrs. Dalrymple has hers. Surprise, then laughter. He paused. And Mr. Ashcroft had his line too. Silence tightened. What line? Miss Grant asked. Poirot looked at the empty chair. After the speech, perhaps. The words, repeated in the quiet, seemed suddenly strange, as though they belonged to a script rather than a spontaneous moment. Poirot continued. And then, without speaking another line aloud, he exited the scene. Lady Margaret's voice cracked slightly. Do you truly believe he planned to disappear in front of us? Poirot regarded her carefully. I believe he planned to disappear because of you. The guests stared. Poirot softened the blow with explanation, as he always did, because he understood that truth, delivered without structure, becomes cruelty. My friends, I do not mean you are wicked. I mean you are civilized. Civilization is built upon small agreements. We do not stare, we do not pry, we do not embarrass. These agreements make life bearable, but they can also be used. Colonel Bristow's voice was tight. Used by whom? Poirot's gaze moved briefly to Mr. Charles Hale. Then away again, as though he were merely noting a detail in passing. Used by anyone who understands the room. Mrs. Dalrymple whispered, so he relied on our manners. Yes, Poirot said simply. He relied on them as one relies on a lock that has been left unlatched. Sir Alister's voice grew harsh. You keep speaking of permission. We did not grant permission. Poirot stepped closer, not aggressively, but with quiet insistence. Permission is rarely spoken, Sir Alister. It is granted in what you do not do. He lifted one hand and began to count on his fingers, precise, methodical. 1, you did not ask where he was going. 2, you did not watch him go. 3, you did not follow. 4, you did not raise alarm when 5 minutes passed, and he did not return. 5, you continued your conversation, as though absence were impolite to acknowledge. Lady Margaret's eyes filled with something like anger and shame combined. We did not wish to cause a scene. Poirot nodded. Exactly. He turned slightly so that they all could see his face. The disappearance required no force, he said softly. No struggle, no raised voice, only silence. The sunset light deepened, shadows lengthened further, reaching across the grass as though trying to close around the chair. And silence, Poirot continued, was abundant. Miss Grant spoke again, quietly, as if thinking aloud. It's true. There was a moment, a pause, when he seemed different, and I let it pass. Poirot's eyes softened. Yes, he said. You let it pass. That is how absence is made. Colonel Bristow frowned. But you make us sound complicit. Poirot did not flinch from the word. In a sense, you were. Sir Alister's face tightened. Then you accuse my guests. Poirot shook his head. Number. I accuse your comfort. That landed more sharply than any accusation of crime. Poirot turned again toward Mr. Charles Hale. Mr. Charles Hale, he said gently, you are a careful man. Hale's expression remained composed, but his eyes sharpened. I try to be. You approached Mr. Ashcroft shortly before he vanished. I conveyed a small matter. You leaned toward him. Yes, in such a manner that others might assume you spoke of something private. Hale hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second, then replied evenly. It was private. Sir Alister glanced at him, irritated. Correspondence is always private. Poirot nodded, still gentle. Of course. Yet privacy is a powerful word. It discourages interruption. Lady Margaret stared at Hale now, seeing him perhaps for the first time not as an efficient extension of her husband, but as a person with independent motion. Poirot continued, still addressing Hale. And then, after you leaned in, Mr. Ashcroft glanced toward the hedges. He stood. He folded his napkin. He left. Hale's voice remained steady. I cannot speak to his motives. No, Poirot agreed, but you can speak to your own movements. Hale's gaze flickered toward Sir Alister, then returned to Poirot. I performed my duties. Poirot allowed the phrase to hang performed. Then he turned back to the group at large. My friends, he said, there is something you must understand. When people wish not to see, they become excellent at it. The mind has a gift for turning away from discomfort, while convincing itself it is behaving nobly. Mrs. Dalrymple whispered. We told ourselves it was kindness. Yes, said Poirot, kindness. He returned to the empty chair and rested his hand lightly on its back. This chair is not simply empty, he said softly. It is evidence of your agreement. Lady Margaret's voice trembled. Agreement to what? Poirot looked at her with grave kindness. Agreement to let a man pass without question. Sir Alister's voice was low now, stripped of bluster. And if we had questioned him, Poirot answered immediately. Then the plan would have failed. Mrs. Dalrymple inhaled sharply. So, there was a plan. Yes. Mr. Reeves, trying to regain footing, said bitterly, and we were the audience. Poirot nodded. Yes, you were the audience. He stepped back, allowing them to see the chair, the table, the cooling lemonade, the folded napkin. You know, Poirot said quietly, why performances are successful, because audiences want them to be. They suspend doubt. They accept what is presented. He let the silence grow, then added, and what was presented to you today was normality. Lady Margaret's eyes filled again. I feel foolish. Poirot's voice softened further. Do not. Feeling foolish is the beginning of wisdom. Colonel Bristow muttered. What do you want from us now? Poirot looked at him steadily. I want honesty. Mrs. Dalrymple's lips parted. We have been honest. Poirot shook his head gently. You have been polite. He glanced around the circle once more. Politeness said, do not interrupt. Politeness said, do not pry. Politeness said, continue the conversation. Politeness said, if a man appears anxious, give him privacy. His eyes held theirs. And so you did. Sir Alister's shoulders slumped slightly. What are you implying? Poirot answered with careful gravity. That Mr. Ashcroft's disappearance was not hidden from you by darkness or distance. It was hidden from you by your own refinement. A faint wind stirred the roses, and somewhere a glass clinked as a distant guest, still unaware, laughed too brightly. Poirot's voice lowered once more. Remember, he said, permission need not be spoken. It is granted in silence. It is granted when comfort is protected at the expense of curiosity. He paused, then added a final sentence, quiet as dusk. And today, your silence was abundant enough to make a man vanish. No one spoke. The empty chair remained at the center of them all, no longer a polite absence, but an accusation shaped like wicker and cloth. Poirot looked toward the hedges, the concealed gap, the hidden gravel, the direction in which two sets of footprints had gone. Now, he said gently, we shall discover who understood that silence and who arranged to use it. Chapter 8, The Missing Motive. Twilight did not descend abruptly upon the Winthrop garden. It advanced with discretion, as though mindful of the company it approached. The last gold of afternoon thinned into amber, then into a softer hue that blurred edges and gentled surfaces. Lanterns along the terrace were lit one by one, their glow contained within frosted glass, offering illumination without intrusion. The party had not dispersed, but it had altered. Clusters of guests lingered with lowered voices. Laughter, when it occurred, was brief and unconvincing. The musicians, uncertain whether their service was still required, packed their instruments with careful restraint. At the center of it all, Hercule Poirot stood once more among the principal figures, his mind moving with the steady precision of a craftsman, aligning the final pieces of an intricate mechanism. He had examined the path. He had observed the summer house. He had exposed the silence that enabled departure. Now he turned toward the most delicate question of all. Motive. Sir Alister broke the quiet first. If this was arranged, he said, his tone strained between irritation and unease, if Percival Ashcroft departed according to some premeditated design, then there must be a reason. One does not vanish from respectable society for amusement. No, Poirot agreed softly. One vanishes for necessity. Mrs. Dalrymple hesitated, then spoke with visible reluctance. There have been rumors. Lady Margaret stiffened. Rumors are the currency of boredom. Yes, Mrs. Dalrymple replied quickly, but sometimes they are also the currency of truth. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Let us speak plainly. We are no longer at tea. Colonel Bristow exhaled heavily. He owed considerable sums. The words seemed to draw the last warmth from the air. Sir Alister turned sharply. That is not established. It is whispered, Colonel Bristow said, and in financial circles, whispers are rarely without foundation. Miss Grant spoke quietly, her voice steady. I overheard mention of a failed investment, something involving overseas holdings, Mr. Reeves added, less dramatically than usual, and letters. I have heard that he received letters daily for the past fortnight, registered post. Sir Alister's jaw tightened. He never mentioned it. Poirot's eyes settled upon him thoughtfully. Desperation prefers silence. The phrase landed with quiet finality. Lady Margaret pressed her fingers to her temple. Percival has always been careful, prudent. Careful men, Poirot said gently, are sometimes undone not by extravagance, but by trust. Mrs. Dalrymple swallowed. You believe he was ruined? Poirot did not answer immediately. He walked a few slow paces across the lawn, examining nothing in particular, as though motive might be written faintly upon the grass. Let us consider, he said at last. A man burdened by debt, letters arriving with increasing urgency, perhaps threats of public exposure, Perhaps legal consequence. Such a man is cornered. He turned back toward them. But Mr. Ashcroft did not appear frantic. He did not pace. He did not drink excessively. He stirred his lemonade with composure. Miss Grant's brow furrowed, as though he had already decided something. "Precisely," said Poirot. Colonel Bristow crossed his arms. "Are you saying he fled?" Poirot's expression sharpened. "Not fled, departed with assistance." The distinction was deliberate. Mrs. Dalrymple gasped faintly. "Assistance from whom?" Lady Margaret's voice trembled slightly. "Who would help him?" Poirot regarded them all carefully before replying. "Someone who benefited from his absence." Sir Alister's face darkened. "That is a dangerous suggestion." Poirot's tone remained calm. Dangerous truths often are. He moved closer to the terrace, where lantern light cast elongated shapes upon the stone. "Consider the elegance of the arrangement," he continued. "A public disappearance at a respectable gathering, no body, no scandalous outburst, merely absence." Mrs. Dalrymple whispered. "To vanish publicly is to erase privately." Poirot looked at her with faint approval. "Yes," Sir Alister bristled. "You imply that he intended to escape disgrace by staging confusion." "I imply," said Poirot gently, "that he chose a setting where confusion would appear accidental." Miss Grant's eyes widened. The party offered him an audience and a shield. Poirot inclined his head. "Exactly." Colonel Bristow frowned deeply. "But if he vanished, creditors would still pursue him." "Not if they believe him temporarily unaccounted for," Poirot replied. "Time is purchased. Delay is gained in financial distress. Delay can be salvation." Sir Alister's voice sharpened. "Salvation for whom? Himself, perhaps." Poirot's gaze drifted, once more, toward Mr. Charles Hale. "Or perhaps for another." Hale remained composed, yet a faint tightening around his mouth betrayed tension. Mrs. Dalrymple's eyes followed Poirot's glance. "You think someone stood to gain?" "Yes, from Percival's ruin, or from his removal." Sir Alister took a step forward. "Speak plainly." "Poirot, I always do." He turned slowly, ensuring that each face met his gaze. "If Mr. Ashcroft's debts became public, certain reputations might suffer, business partnerships might be questioned, investments examined, alliances scrutinized." Colonel Bristow's expression shifted subtly. "You suggest that his disgrace would not be his alone." "Financial disgrace," Poirot said, "is rarely solitary." Lady Margaret's voice wavered. "Are you implying that our household—" "I imply nothing yet," Poirot interrupted gently. "I am constructing." He clasped his hands behind his back. "Let us consider another angle. Suppose Mr. Ashcroft confided in someone. Suppose that person advised him that a quiet disappearance might prevent immediate scandal. Suppose arrangements were made, transportation, funds, perhaps a new identity for a time." Miss Grant spoke slowly. "If he intended escape, why the blank envelope in the summer house?" A signal, Poirot replied, confirmation that all was prepared, that the moment had arrived. Colonel Bristow shook his head. "But if he fled, why do it so publicly? Why not leave quietly from his own residence?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Because departure from one's residence invites inspection. Servants notice trunks. Carriages are summoned. Neighbors observe." He gestured toward the lawn. "But departure from a garden party can be mistaken for a stroll." Sir Alister's voice had lost its earlier authority. "You are suggesting that he orchestrated his own disappearance in our presence?" "Yes." "And that someone assisted him?" "Yes." Lady Margaret clasped her hands tightly. Who Poirot did not answer at once. Instead, he turned the question back upon them. Who had knowledge of his financial difficulty? Colonel Bristow hesitated. "In certain circles, it was known." "Which circles?" Poirot asked. "Investment circles, business partners." Poirot nodded slowly. "And who among you shares business dealings with Mr. Ashcroft?" Silence. Sir Alister's gaze flickered momentarily toward Hale. Poirot noticed. "Sir Alister," Sir Alister's voice was controlled, but the control was effortful. Percival and I discussed certain ventures, nothing improper. Were you aware of his debts? I was aware of strain. Did you advise him? I advised prudence. Poirot studied him carefully. And Mr. Charles Hale. Hale's posture remained immaculate. I manage correspondence, he said evenly. I am aware of what passes through Sir Alister's office. And did letters addressed to Mr. Ashcroft pass through your hands? Yes. Letters of urgency. Hale hesitated. Yes. Mrs. Dalrymple inhaled sharply. You knew. Hale's voice remained calm. I knew he was under pressure. Poirot's gaze did not waver. And pressure prefers discretion. Hale did not answer. The lanterns flickered slightly in the growing dark. Poirot spoke again quietly. Motive is not always crime. Sometimes it is survival. Miss Grant nodded slowly. He was cornered. Yes, Poirot said, cornered by obligations heavier than courtesy allowed. Sir Alister's voice trembled slightly. And so he vanished. Not vanished, Poirot corrected once more. Departed. Mrs. Dalrymple whispered, with assistance. Yes, Lady Margaret's eyes filled with anxious urgency. Then he is alive. Poirot regarded her with steady seriousness. I believe so. Relief and fear warred visibly in her expression. But if he is alive, Colonel Bristow said, then this is no crime. Poirot's eyes sharpened faintly. Absence can be a crime if it is designed to conceal greater consequence. Sir Alister's face drained slightly of colour. What greater consequence? Poirot's voice softened again, but its precision sharpened. If Mr. Ashcroft's disappearance shields not only himself but another, if debts are intertwined, if signatures are shared, if investments are co-owned, then the removal of one party may preserve the reputation of the other. Mrs. Dalrymple stared at him. You think someone benefited from his absence? Yes. Poirot's gaze rested once more, briefly, but unmistakably, upon Mr. Charles Hale. Some unknown, he said quietly, who stood nearest to him at the moment of departure. Hale's composure faltered at last. That is speculation. Poirot nodded lightly. For now. He turned away, looking once more at the empty chair. The party offered him an audience and a shield. He said softly, your silence provided cover. The hidden path provided route. The summer house provided confirmation. He lifted his eyes. And the motive? He allowed a small pause. The motive lies not in violence, but in escape. Miss Grant spoke almost reverently. To vanish publicly is to erase privately. Yes, Poirot said. Sir Alister's voice was low, nearly pleading. Then there was no crime. Poirot looked at him with measured gravity. That remains to be seen. The lantern light flickered across the wicker chair, casting lattice shadows upon the grass. And somewhere beyond the hedges, beyond the gravel, beyond the reach of polite society, a man burdened by debt had stepped into uncertainty. Perhaps willingly, perhaps guided. The motive was forming, and it was not as simple as cowardice. Chapter 9. The confession of the crowd dusk settled not as a curtain dropped, but as a slow exhalation. The last amber of evening thinned into violet along the horizon, and the lanterns now cast fuller halos upon the terrace stones. Beyond the hedges, the world continued in its ordinary rhythm. Distant carriage wheels, a dog's bark, the faint suggestion of wind through trees. But within the Winthrop garden, the air had cooled into something heavier. Understanding, like night, does not arrive all at once. It spreads gradually, filling spaces that light once occupied. And so it was now. The guests no longer protested. They no longer defended. They remembered. Hercule Poirot stood once more near the central table. The empty wicker chair had become less an object than a witness. Its woven back cast lattice shadows upon the grass, and those shadows crossed one another, like the overlapping footprints on the hidden path. He allowed the silence to lengthen when he spoke. It was with quiet certainty. You begin to recall. No one contradicted him. Mrs. Dalrymple drew in a slow breath. There was a pause, she said faintly. I see it now, just before he stood. Colonel Bristow nodded reluctantly. Yes. Hale leaned toward him. I remember thinking it must be something tedious. Accounts, perhaps. Sir Alister's head turned sharply. Hale handles correspondence. It would not be unusual. No, Poirot agreed softly. It would not be unusual. That is precisely why it succeeded. Miss Grant stepped forward slightly, her face pale but composed. There was a nod, she said. A small one, between them. Poirot's eyes sharpened. A nod. Yes, not exaggerated, not conspicuous, but deliberate. Lady Margaret pressed her hand to her throat. I remember turning away at that moment. I did not wish to overhear. Of course, Poirot murmured. Privacy must be respected. Mr. Reeves gave a strained half-laugh. We are very respectful. Yes, Poirot said. Very. The secretary stood rigid now, his composure less effortless than before. His hands were clasped neatly behind his back, but the fingers tightened visibly against one another. Mr. Charles Hale, Poirot said gently, you walked beside him. Hale's lips parted slightly. I escorted him. Sir, Alister stared. Escorted. The word struck like a dropped glass. Hale's voice remained controlled, though it required effort. He asked for privacy. Poirot's gaze did not leave his face. And you ensured no one interrupted. Hale hesitated, then nodded once. Yes, Lady Margaret's voice trembled. You mean, you knew? Hale drew in a measured breath. I knew he intended to leave the lawn. To leave the lawn, Poirot repeated softly. Mrs. Dalrymple stared at Hale in dawning comprehension. You walked with him through the hedge. Yes. Colonel Bristow's voice hardened. And along the gravel path? Yes. Sir Alister's face had lost colour. Why? Hale met his employer's gaze for a fleeting second, then lowered it again. He requested discretion. Poirot inclined his head slightly. And discretion is your profession. Hale did not answer. Miss Grant's voice was quiet, but firm. You stood at his shoulder in the summer-house. Hale's jaw tightened. Yes. And the envelope? Poirot asked. Hale hesitated, and in that hesitation lay confession more potent than words. I placed it there earlier, he said at last. A ripple passed through the group. Sir Alister stepped back as though struck. You prepared it? Yes, with blank paper, Poirot added calmly. Hale nodded. It was the signal. Mrs. Dalrymple whispered. Signal of what? Hale's composure fractured slightly. That arrangements were complete. The words hung in the lantern, lit air. Sir Alister's voice shook. Arrangements for what? Hale looked directly at Poirot now, as though accepting that concealment had expired. For departure. Poirot's tone remained almost gentle. For disappearance. Yes. Lady Margaret covered her mouth. Percival intended this. Yes. Miss Grant's eyes glistened faintly. And you helped him. Hale's voice lowered. I did. Colonel Bristow stepped forward. Why loyalty, compassion? Hale's expression shifted. Pain, perhaps, or fatigue. Because ruin would not have been his alone. The silence deepened. Poirot did not move. He allowed the admission to settle into them. Sir Alister's voice was barely audible. Explain. Hale straightened slightly, as though the truth itself lent structure. Certain ventures were jointly held. If his debts became public, questions would follow. Questions regarding signatures, regarding guarantees. Sir Alister closed his eyes briefly. You mean to say, yes, Hale said quietly. His collapse would have implicated others. Mrs. Dalrymple looked from Hale to Sir Alister in horror. You? Sir Alister did not answer. Poirot's voice remained composed. Mr. Ashcroft had been cornered, letters had grown more severe, creditors impatient, exposure imminent. Hale nodded once. He feared public scandal more than insolvency. And so he chose, Poirot continued, to vanish publicly, in order to erase privately. Yes. Lady Margaret's voice broke. He trusted you, yes. And you trusted us, Poirot added softly. Hale looked at him sharply. What do you mean? You trusted the crowd. Hale's silence was confirmation. Poirot gestured lightly toward the assembled guests. You knew their habits, their civility, their reluctance to intrude. You knew that if Mr. Ashcroft rose during animated debate, no one would challenge him. Mrs. Dalrymple whispered. We all pretended not to see. Poirot nodded slowly. Precisely. He turned slightly, addressing them all now. The disappearance was not hidden. It was collectively unobserved. Colonel Bristow's face reddened with shame. We were fools. No, Poirot corrected gently. You were polite. Miss Grant's voice was steady, and he walked beside him. Yes, Poirot said. Mr. Charles Hale walked beside him. Sir Alister's voice trembled with restrained anger. You placed my household at risk. Hale met his gaze. I preserved it. The lantern light flickered, casting moving shadows across their faces. Poirot spoke again, his tone calm but firm. In the summer house, the blank envelope confirmed readiness. Transportation arranged. Funds secured a train departing at an hour calculated to avoid notice. Hale's eyes widened slightly. You have remarkable inference. I have footprints, Poirot replied. Sir Alister's voice cracked. Where is he now? Hale's answer was quiet. On the late evening train to the coast from there, further arrangements. Lady Margaret swayed slightly, then steadied herself. So he is alive? Yes. Mrs. Dalrymple wiped her eyes. And we assisted. Poirot's gaze softened. You provided the stage. He looked once more at the empty chair. The crowd performed its final act. The words fell gently, yet they sealed the narrative. Colonel Bristow exhaled sharply. There was no violence, no abduction. No, Poirot agreed. Only design. Sir Alister stared at Hale. You should have told me. Hale's expression was weary. You would have refused. Yes, and he would have been exposed. Sir Alister did not answer. Miss Grant spoke, almost to herself. He looked relieved when he stood. Poirot nodded. Yes. Relief can resemble anxiety when one is leaving everything behind. Mrs. Dalrymple glanced toward the hedge. We could have stopped him. Could you? Poirot asked softly. The question lingered. Would they have challenged him? Would they have risked awkwardness, scandal, confrontation? Silence answered. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. My friends, understand this. You were not deceived by trickery. You were guided by expectation. You expected civility, so you perceived it. You expected continuity, so you supplied it. He turned to Hale once more. You calculated correctly. Hale inclined his head faintly. Yes. Sir Alister's voice was low, stripped of authority. What happens now? Poirot's expression grew thoughtful. Now we consider whether departure alone resolves the matter. Mrs. Dalrymple blinked. Is there more? Poirot looked toward the darkening hedge. There is always more. He allowed his gaze to sweep the assembled faces one final time. You recall the nod, the pause, the turning away of eyes. That is your confession, not of crime, but of complicity. He stepped slightly aside, leaving the empty chair once more at the center of their vision. Mr. Charles Hale walked beside him, he repeated quietly. And in that repetition lay both revelation and reckoning. The garden, once a scene of laughter, now held only the sound of cooling air and the faint hum of lantern flames. Understanding had arrived, but resolution had not yet fully declared itself. Chapter 10. The moment unseen night completed what dusk had begun. The garden, so recently warmed by debate and civility, now lay beneath a vault of dark velvet sky. The lanterns along the terrace flickered in steady intervals, their glow no longer decorative but necessary. Beyond the hedges, the countryside had dissolved into shadow. The gravel path was invisible, except where a stray glimmer of light caught upon pale stone. The guests had thinned. Some had departed quietly, offering polite farewells that rang hollow against the evening's revelations. Others lingered near the terrace, speaking in subdued tones, as though any raised voice might disturb the fragile equilibrium that had replaced the afternoon's bright assurance. At the center of the lawn remained the small circular table and the empty wicker chair. No one had moved it. It had become, without ceremony, a monument. Hercule Poirot stood a short distance away, hands clasped behind his back, observing it not with triumph, but with contemplation. The indentation in the cushion had vanished entirely now. The napkin remained folded. The lemonade glass, its contents long warmed, had been discreetly removed by the servants. Order had been restored, visibly. Yet nothing was as it had been. Sir Alister approached him slowly. The host's geniality, once effortless, now seemed like an ill-fitting garment he could not quite remove. "So," he said at last, his voice low, "there was no crime." Poirot did not answer immediately. He studied the lantern light reflecting faintly upon the table's polished surface, then turned his gaze toward the hedge beyond which the hidden path lay concealed. "Only a carefully timed exit," he said. Sir Alister exhaled, a breath not of relief, but of resignation. Lady Margaret joined them, her composure restored in form, if not in spirit. "And we were complicit," Poirot inclined his head gently. "You provided the curtain." The phrase did not accuse, it explained. Mr. Charles Hale stood slightly apart, his posture straight, his face pale in the lantern glow. The confession had left him quieter, but not broken. He carried the expression of a man who had chosen loyalty and accepted consequence. "Will he be safe?" Hale asked. Poirot regarded him steadily. "Safer than he was here." Sir Alister stiffened faintly at that. "You imply this house is dangerous." "I imply," Poirot said softly, "that reputation can suffocate more efficiently than any adversary." The wind stirred lightly through the roses. A petal detached itself and fell soundlessly upon the grass. Miss Grant approached as well, her voice thoughtful. "Yes," Hale confirmed quietly. "The late departure from Westborough Junction, few passengers, no publicity." "And from there?" Colonel Bristow asked, joining the small circle. "Further travel," Hale replied, arranged discreetly. Poirot nodded. "Time will pass, creditors will pursue shadows, eventually negotiations may occur, debts may be restructured or forgotten." Sir Alister's face remained drawn. "You speak as though this is almost admirable." Poirot's expression grew serious. "Desperation does not create heroes. It creates decisions." He turned slowly toward the empty chair again. "My friends," he said quietly, "let us examine the matter once more, not as scandal, not as rumor, but as fact." The others listened without interruption. A man burdened by debt attends a garden party. He sits among acquaintances who value decorum above discomfort. He exchanges a nod with a trusted ally. He stands during animated debate. He glances toward concealment. He walks calmly through a hedge and along a hidden path. He pauses in a summer house, receives confirmation, and departs toward a prearranged train. He paused. At no point does he raise his voice. At no point does he struggle. At no point does he struggle. At no point does he lie. Lady Margaret frowned faintly. He lied by omission. "Yes," Poirot agreed. "But omission thrives only when others permit it." Mrs. Dalrymple, who had returned quietly, clasped her hands. "We could have stopped him. You would have required courage," he said. "Courage to risk embarrassment, courage to question a friend in public, courage to disrupt harmony." Colonel Bristow muttered, "We lacked courage." "No," Poirot replied softly, "you lacked curiosity." The distinction was deliberate. Sir Alister's voice sharpened slightly. "You seem determined to make philosophy of this." Poirot's gaze was calm. Because the mystery was never mechanical, it was human. The lantern flames flickered again, casting momentary shadows that crossed and separated. Poirot continued, "You searched for violence. You searched for abduction. You searched for a villain lurking behind roses. He gestured lightly toward the hedge, but the true mystery was simpler. Miss Grant's voice was almost reverent. The willing blindness. Poirot inclined his head. Yes. He stepped closer to the empty chair and rested his gloved fingertips upon its woven back. In that single shared moment, he said softly, you chose not to see. The words did not wound, they clarified. Sir Alister looked away toward the dark hedge. I thought it was courtesy. So did he, Poirot replied. Hale's voice was quiet. He counted on it. Yes, Lady Margaret spoke slowly. He knew we would not question him. Precisely. Mrs. Dalrymple's eyes glistened. And so we smiled. Yes, the night seemed to draw closer around them, as though enclosing the garden in a final act. Poirot straightened. There was no abduction, he said. No coercion. No physical crime. Sir Alister repeated faintly. Then there was no crime. Poirot met his gaze steadily. There was an arrangement. Colonel Bristow frowned. And arrangements are legal. Sometimes, Poirot said, sometimes they are merely convenient. He looked once more at Hale. You ensured the path was clear. Yes. You placed the envelope. Yes. You walked beside him. Yes. And you trusted the crowd to perform its part. Hale swallowed. Yes. Poirot nodded slowly. Then the execution was precise. Miss Grant's voice trembled faintly. Will he ever return? Poirot considered before answering. Perhaps when absence no longer protects. Sir Alister's voice was hollow. And what remains for us? Poirot looked at each of them in turn. Memory. They absorbed that in silence. The empty chair, he continued softly, is no longer a puzzle. It is a reminder. Of what? Lady Margaret asked. That civilization can conceal as easily as it can protect. Mrs. Dalrymple wiped her eyes. I shall never attend a garden party again without watching the chairs. A faint smile touched Poirot's lips. That would be progress. Sir Alister drew himself upright, attempting to reclaim dignity. Very well, Percival Ashcroft has departed. We shall manage what remains. Poirot inclined his head. I believe you shall. Hale stepped forward slightly. You will not pursue him. Poirot regarded him with quiet assessment. For what offense? Hale hesitated. Deception. Poirot's eyes softened. Deception is not always a crime. Sometimes it is survival. He turned toward the hedge once more, imagining the path beyond. The gravel bearing two sets of prints, the summer house waiting in shadow. A train moves through darkness, he said quietly. It carries a man who chose absence over exposure. It leaves behind questions, debts, and silence. He faced them again, but the essential mystery has been resolved. Sir Alister asked, almost reluctantly, which was? Poirot's gaze held steady. Not how he vanished. He paused deliberately. But why you did not stop him? The lanterns flickered like fading applause. The garden, once animated by laughter, now rested in contemplative quiet. Poirot placed his hat upon his head with precise care. Remember, he said softly, absence requires only agreement. He inclined his head to the assembled company and began to walk toward the terrace, his figure gradually merging with the interplay of light and shadow. Behind him, the empty wicker chair remained, not as evidence of crime, but as testament to a moment unseen.